America asked for a ceasefire. Iran rejected it in public. And that single moment told you more about the state of power in the modern world than 100 official speeches ever could. Because this was never just about diplomacy. It was never just about one interview, one statement, or one round of missiles. What you saw was something much bigger. You saw the moment a system revealed itself, when the stronger side starts talking about stopping the fight, and the side under pressure says, no, you are not watching a normal phase of war anymore. You are watching a credibility event, a reversal event, the point where the structure underneath the conflict becomes visible, and once that structure becomes visible, everything changes. This is why so many people misread moments like this. They focus on the headline, but ignore the machine behind it. They hear the word ceasefire and assume it means peace. They hear rejection and assume it means emotion. But in geopolitical reality, words like ceasefire, negotiation, restraint, and de-escalation do not always mean what they seem to mean. Sometimes a ceasefire is not a peace offer. Sometimes it is a pressure valve. Sometimes it is an attempt to freeze a conflict before the costs spread wider. And sometimes, when the other side sees that clearly, rejection becomes strategy. That is what makes this moment so important. Because power is not just about who can strike harder. Power is about who can endure longer, who can absorb more cost, who can keep the system functioning while the pressure rises, who can still impose terms after the first shock fails. That is the real test, and history shows the same pattern again and again. A great power builds an order. It surrounds itself with alliances, money, logistics, legitimacy, military reach, and a story about why its position is natural. Then that order expands. More commitments, more fronts, more assumptions, more confidence that pressure can always be controlled. Then comes the crisis, not because the power suddenly disappears, but because its limits become measurable. And once those limits become measurable, the weaker side no longer needs to win in the conventional sense. It only needs to make the stronger side pay more than it expected to pay. That is the point where the trap closes. And once you understand that pattern, the present starts to look much less chaotic. Take Suez in 1956. Britain and France still believed they could behave like old imperial powers. Egypt nationalized the canal. London and Paris decided force would restore order, restore prestige, and restore obedience. On paper, that sounded plausible. They had military power. They had history behind them. They had the old instincts of empire. But what they did not have was strategic freedom. The United States opposed them. Financial pressure hit Britain. The system around the battlefield turned against the battlefield itself. And suddenly, the states that launched the intervention discovered that having guns was not the same thing as controlling the outcome. They had escalated, but they could not decide the ending. That was the revelation. Then, Vietnam. Again, the same machine. The United States built a theory of containment and credibility. It believed its reach, industry, and military superiority would make the conflict manageable. Advisors became deployments. Deployments became bombing. Bombing became a long war. Then Tet exposed the central weakness, not on a map, but in perception. The war was no longer being judged by the number of bombs dropped. It was being judged by whether the strongest state in the world could still turn destruction into control. Once that answer became doubtful, the logic began to reverse. The question was no longer how America would win. The question became how America would leave, then Afghanistan for the Soviet Union. Another great power, another intervention launched with confidence, another assumption that force could stabilize the periphery. But the longer the war lasted, the more it exposed the cost of staying. Not just money, not just casualties. Credibility, political energy, strategic stamina. The insurgents did not need to conquer Moscow. They only needed to prove that the Soviet system could spend enormous force without producing a lasting political result. Once that was visible, the war became bigger than the battlefield. 3 different empires, 3 different eras, same pattern. Build the order, stretch the order, expose the limits. Watch the stronger side seek stability after the balance has already shifted. Now bring that pattern to the present. For decades, the United States built a regional order in the Middle East based on overwhelming reach. Bases, fleets, sanctions, intelligence, arms networks, diplomatic leverage, dollar centrality, layered deterrence. The message was simple. Washington would decide where the escalation line was, and everyone else would respond within that framework. Even when challenges emerged, the underlying assumption stayed intact. America could absorb the shock. America could manage the pace. America could open and close the crisis. That was the foundation. Then came expansion, more pressure campaigns, more unresolved regional confrontations, more commitments tied to allies, sea lanes, missile defense, domestic politics, oil stability, and strategic credibility. The architecture became larger, but also more sensitive. Because the larger a system becomes, the more expensive disruption becomes. More moving parts means more points of failure. More dependence means more exposure. And that is the contradiction late-stage power always struggles to admit. The system looks strongest right before it becomes fragile in public. Then came the crisis. Recent reporting shows Iran publicly rejecting ceasefire pressure and signaling that negotiations would not happen under attack, while the wider war drove fears around oil, shipping, and regional escalation. That matters because once energy, markets, military signaling, and political credibility are all moving at the same time, the conflict stops being a battlefield event and becomes a systems event. And in a systems event, perception is not secondary. Perception is part of the battlefield. So when America and its partners appear to want to pause, and Iran signals that a pause now serves the attacker more than the attacked, the meaning is clear. The issue is no longer just military exchange. The issue is leverage. Who benefits from time? Who needs calm first? Who is trying to prevent the cost curve from getting steeper? That is why the public rejection mattered. It was not just defiance, it was positioning. It was Iran saying, in effect, if you began this with force, you do not get to define the off-ramp the moment force starts producing wider consequences. You do not get to strike first and then rebrand restraint as moral authority when the regional and economic costs begin to spread. That is a very different message from the one many viewers heard. Many people heard anger. The more important thing was structure, because a weaker state only speaks that way when it believes the stronger side's need for de-escalation is becoming visible. And once that happens, the meaning of everything shifts. A ceasefire stops sounding like peace and starts sounding like containment. Negotiations stop sounding like diplomacy and start sounding like a test of who really needs the table. Public messaging stops sounding symbolic and starts sounding like cost signaling. That is the hidden layer most coverage misses. Because the modern audience is trained to look at war like a sequence of dramatic clips, a strike, a speech, a retaliation, a statement from a foreign minister, a market reaction, then on to the next headline. But power does not operate clip by clip. Power operates through systems, through endurance, through how many shocks a structure can absorb before it starts revealing its internal limits. And those limits are exactly what matter now. The world entering this crisis is not stable. It is loaded with debt, loaded with political polarization, loaded with fragile supply chains, loaded with energy sensitivity, and loaded with governments that are already carrying more economic and social pressure than they can comfortably manage. Reuters recently reported that global debt reached a record $348 trillion in 2025. That means every major geopolitical escalation now hits a world that is already financially stretched. So war is not just measured in missiles. It is measured in bond stress, insurance spikes, shipping disruptions, fiscal pressure, and market fear. That is why the strongest power can still find itself strategically constrained even while remaining militarily dominant. This is the hardest truth for people to accept. Power can be real and limited at the same time. America still has immense force, that is obvious. But immense force is not the same thing as unlimited strategic freedom. The question is not whether America can hit harder. Of course it can. The question is whether hitting harder still guarantees control of the ending. That is where empires get into trouble. Because when leaders are used to escalation working, they begin to think escalation is always available as a solution. They forget that every use of force also creates a cost structure around that force. Political costs, financial costs, alliance costs, market costs, narrative costs. And once the opponent learns how to push against those costs, the stronger side can find itself in a position it hates most. Still powerful, but no longer fully in command of the sequence. That is what moments like this reveal. Not collapse, not surrender, exposure. And exposure is dangerous because it changes the behavior of everyone watching. Allies start recalculating, rivals start probing. Markets start pricing risk differently. Regional actors start asking whether Washington still controls the ladder of escalation as tightly as before. And every new test becomes slightly easier to imagine because one very important thing has already happened. Resistance has been normalized. That may be the biggest shift of all. An empire can survive criticism. It can survive casualties. It can survive failed predictions. What it struggles to survive is the public normalization of defiance. Because once defiance is normalized, deterrence becomes less automatic. Once deterrence becomes less automatic, credibility becomes more expensive to maintain. And once credibility becomes more expensive to maintain, every future crisis arrives with higher stakes than the last one. That is why this moment is bigger than one war. It tells you the old script is no longer functioning as smoothly as before. The old script said, the stronger side sets the pace, the weaker side reacts, pressure creates negotiations, and negotiations occur on terms defined by the side with the larger system. But if the weaker side now believes that time itself can work against the stronger side by raising energy fears, widening market stress, and exposing political limits, then the whole script changes. Now time is a weapon. Now refusal is a weapon. Now endurance is a weapon. Now even a televised rejection becomes a weapon. And once that stage begins, every new development matters more than it seems to matter. A market move is not just a market move. A delayed negotiation is not just a delayed negotiation. A public statement is not just a public statement. Each becomes evidence in a larger argument about who can still bear the cost of continuation. So when people say this is just rhetoric, they are missing the point. Rhetoric is part of cost management. Public language tells allies whether to stay calm, tells markets whether to panic, tells domestic audiences whether sacrifice is temporary, and tells the enemy whether pressure is working. In modern conflict, language is not separate from strategy. It is strategy performed in real time. That is exactly why Iran's public rejection landed so hard. It told the world that Tehran did not believe the current moment favored immediate pause. It told the world that continued pressure might now be generating costs beyond the battlefield. And most importantly, it told the world that the stronger side's preferred timing was no longer being automatically accepted. That is the kind of signal history remembers. Not because it ends everything in one day, but because it reveals what the next phase will be built on. And the next phase is always the most dangerous one. Because once a system's limits become visible, decision makers face the same temptation every time. Double down and try to restore fear. Rebrand the situation and try to preserve credibility. Seek a pause and hope the public reads it as wisdom rather than necessity. None of these options are clean. That is the problem. Once the machine is exposed, every move is more costly than before. So the real warning here is not that some final collapse arrives tomorrow. It is that the conflict has entered the phase where even attempts at stabilization may confirm instability. That is when history starts speeding up, not always in events, in meaning. A strike means more. A rejection means more. A failed proposal means more. A market tremor means more, because every part of the system is now being interpreted through one central question. Who needs the next pause more? That is the question viewers should carry forward. Not who gave the better speech, not who looked calmer on television, not who has the bigger arsenal. Who needs the next pause more? Because that question gets closer to the truth than most headlines ever will. And once you start seeing conflict that way, you stop getting lost in the surface drama. You stop treating each event like a random episode. You begin to see the deeper sequence. Systems expand, systems overreach, systems reveal their hidden costs. And once those hidden costs become visible, the weaker side starts fighting the structure instead of the army. That is the revelation. And if you ignore it, you will keep being surprised by moments that are actually predictable. So no, this was not just a media moment. It was not just a diplomatic disagreement. It was not just Iran being stubborn or America being cautious. It was a structural signal, a live demonstration that the old machinery of pressure is no longer producing automatic obedience, a warning that power in this era is increasingly measured by who can survive the consequences of escalation, not just who can begin it. And that should concern anyone still telling themselves that this time is different, because history is full of powers that believed scale would save them, technology would save them, finance would save them, prestige would save them, narrative would save them. But systems do not care about self-image. They care about cost. They care about endurance. They care about whether force can still be converted into control. That is the only question that matters now. And if you want to understand what comes next, how the machine was built, why these credibility breaks are happening more often, and what usually follows once the stronger side's limits become visible, then stay with this channel, because the most dangerous stage is not the opening strike. It is the stage after the revelation, when every player in the system starts acting on what they have just learned.